helmet. It should also be noted that Mr. Fendler was listening to music through Bluetooth headphones inside his helmet. Shortly after entering the store, Mr. Fendler was briefly approached by one of the managers, but Mr. Fendler fails to acknowledge their presence and continues walking. The manager stalls for a moment, and approximately 1 minute later he approaches Mr. Fendler from behind, but he is ignored again. Mr. Fendler continued shopping for another 10 minutes, and after checking out and stopping at a bench inside the store to organize his backpack, he was confronted by several officers of the Sahuarita Police Department.
Bud, you got some ID on you? Hey.
Hey!
You have some ID on you? Hold over. What's up? You have some ID on you? Yep. No problem? Yeah, management's been asking you to take your helmet off while you're walking around in the store and you're just ignoring them. What are you talking about, man? You think I'm talking just to
Dude, do me a favor, take your helmet off. You're not going to speak with us with your helmet on.
Okay.
At this point, the officers have initiated an investigatory detainment, and Mr. Fendler surrenders his identification without question or protest. The legality of wearing a helmet inside Walmart is irrelevant. The real issue at hand is whether the officers have reasonable suspicion to believe that Mr. Fendler is trespassing, and given that the manager who called 911 said that they had asked Mr. Fendler to leave several times, it is likely that the officers would be within their authority to detain and investigate him. As with many states, citizens in Arizona are required to state their name if a police officer suspects them of committing a crime under Arizona Revised Statute 13-2412, and Mr. Fendler would have been required to state his name if he hadn't peacefully surrendered his ID. It is important to note that Mr. Fendler is detained, because this is when his Fourth Amendment protections come into play. The Supreme Court has dedicated many rulings to developing a legal framework that distinguishes between lawful and unlawful arrests, and over the years, the precedent has become more formalized and developed. In the 1968 case of Terry versus Ohio, the Supreme Court noted that, quote, not all personal intercourse between policemen and citizens involves seizures of persons, and that, quote, only when the officer, by means of physical force or show of authority, has in some way restrained the liberty of a citizen, may we conclude that a seizure has occurred. In the decades between the Terry ruling and the 1991 case of Florida versus Bostic, the reasonable suspicion standard underwent many changes and eventually evolved into a reasonable perception approach. In the Bostic case, the court held that the appropriate inquiry to determine whether a citizen has been seized is, quote, whether a reasonable person would feel free to decline the officer's requests or otherwise terminate the encounter. Given that Mr. Fendler was surrounded by officers and was ordered to present his identification and remove his helmet, it is likely that a court would consider him detained and entitled to constitutional protection.
Sorry?
Oh, man. I have music playing, so if someone's trying to talk to me, I probably can hear them. But I wouldn't try to talk to them.
Well, did you make a purchase?
Yeah. I
Get a
bought
receipt with you?
Dropping everything, man. Yeah, it is. I'm on a little break.
So he said that he had music playing in his helmet.
I walked right up to just like I'm talking to you right now. Stood right there.
Okay.
No,
What do they do with MVD?
yes it is. I live in a motto.
Okay.
So did you see the manager basically walk up right to your face and ask you to take off your helmet? How did you not see that?
I saw him talking, but he's got a headset on.
I'm saying
so.
it right next to you. Right next to you. I came up and I said, sir,
I thought
need
you were going
to stop.
this way. I didn't hear
I
you.
said, stop. I followed you halfway throughout the store.
I have discussed the efficacy of eyewitness testimony in a previous episode, which I will link in the info card above, so I won't spend too much time on it in this episode. But it should be noted that witnesses can be extremely unreliable, and the manager's recollection of events is a testament to that. First, the manager claims that he walked right up to Mr. Fendler and implied that Mr. Fendler intentionally ignored him. As you can see from the surveillance footage, the manager makes a subtle gesture at Mr. Fendler, but remains outside of his field of view for the majority of the encounter. It is easy to see how Mr. Fendler may have been unaware that the manager was trying to speak to him, considering that he was wearing headphones and his view was restricted by the helmet. Next, the manager claims that he followed Mr. Fendler halfway through the store, telling him to stop. But once again, the cameras show that this statement is inaccurate. Although the manager did follow Mr. Fendler across the store, he approached Mr. Mr. Fendler from behind the second time and gave up after being ignored again. The manager implied that there was no way Mr. Fendler could have missed him, even with the headphones on, but the camera footage shows that it is entirely possible that Mr. Fendler was unaware of the manager's presence. Without questioning any other witnesses, reviewing any security footage, or getting Mr. Fendler's side of the story, the officers began their questioning by assuming the manager was being truthful. The officers also allowed the manager to interrogate Mr. Fendler in the midst of their investigation, which only added to the escalation of the interaction. Mr. Fendler continues to answer questions, and for a moment it seems as though he may get the opportunity to explain himself.
Let me ask you something. What's the purpose of keeping the helmet on?
It's just faster to get to work, man. Like I said, I'm on my way to work.
Where do you work at?
Work at Jim Click, right
Okay.
there.
So you walk through the store. What'd you buy?
I bought a sandwich, a Gatorade, 2 peaches, a scrubber, I think 4 pens, and a toothbrush.
Okay.
That's it.
So you just
Basically
kept.
everything on here.
That's it.
I couldn't
So
find a
you
basket.
keep the helmet on. You walk around.
Yeah, I do that
grab
at
all
the
this
Safeway,
stuff.
I go to the other Safeway, I go Fry's. Except for when I go to the bank.
I mean, he knows I know because I ride. He rides.
Yeah.
It's not. It doesn't take much effort to take it off, put it back on. I mean, it takes maybe like 5 seconds, 10 seconds,
It
if that.
doesn't, man, but I've never had any issues where
Uh-huh.
anyone's like, take it off, or a sign saying that you need to have it off. And like I said,
That's
I'm
why
on
the
my way to
manager
work.
asked you to take it off.
Like I said, I didn't hear him. I had music playing throughout the
Okay.
You didn't see me? I'm standing right in front of you.
I saw you there, and then I saw you talk, but like again, you have a headset on, so
I can't put my hands on you to get your attention. I was standing
Oh, yeah,
right next to you.
I
Right?
didn't.
Just like I'm standing
I
here with
didn't
the
see
officer.
you come next to me.
I stood right in front of you, just like I'm standing here. I said, I need you to stop and listen to me. You totally ignored me and kept walking.
Sir,
I got
have music
associates
playing,
that
man.
were upset and concerned because you're walking around with a backpack, with a helmet. Nobody knows who you are.
But I made a purchase.
I'm concerned about the safety of my
I'm going to stop him
associates.
now, okay? You're an argumentative person, and I am not the person you want to argue with. You need to take
You
this
want his?
hand and you need to go like this and pull your head out of your okay? Because you're walking around in a store hiding your face. There's shooters that go on all over the place. This man comes up to you and you want to play. You got a little Senna headpiece going on that you can't stop. You need to listen to learn, not listen to reply. You need to turn that little switch off in your brain that you want to run your mouth and argue every time somebody tells you something. Because this is disturbing the peace. You can go to jail and not go to work. So what's the choice you're going to make, hardhead? You're going to quit walking around businesses with a helmet on, scaring the hell out of people to where you got massive cops all over the place, rifles outside waiting for a shooter to come out? Laugh.
Yeah.
But that's where we're at. So pull your head out of your ass and quit arguing every time somebody tells you something.
I'm just.
I'm
trying to
telling
explain
you,
my-
look at
my
what you're
part.
doing. You keep wanting to argue with me. I'm not the guy you want to argue with.
Wasn't trying to argue. I'm just
That's
trying
why
to
you
state
keep
my
talking.
point.
Stop talking.
Okay, fine. Cool.
This is Officer John George, and his emotional outburst did nothing to progress the investigative intent in Mr. Fendler's detainment. In fact, it hindered the officer's ability to build a complete contextual narrative around the accusations being put forth by the manager. Not only was Officer George's reprimand unprofessional and uncalled for, but it also violated Mr. Fendler's First Amendment right to free speech. In the 1987 case of Houston versus Hill, the Supreme Court held that citizens have a right to voice their opinions to or near police officers, whether or not they are in the performance of their duties. Mr. Fendler was detained when Officer George ordered him to stop talking, which essentially amounts to a government official depriving a citizen of free speech. There are also implications of Fourth Amendment violations associated with Officer George's conduct as well. In the 1983 Supreme Court case of Florida versus Royer, the court recognized that, quote, the scope of the detention must be carefully tailored to its underlying justification, and that, quote, the investigative methods employed should be the least intrusive means reasonably available to verify or dispel the officer's suspicion in a short period of time. Officer George's behavior served no investigative interest, and Mr. Fendler was forced to listen to and obey the officer because he was being detained. Although unlikely, it is possible that a court could find that Officer George violated Mr. Fendler's Fourth Amendment rights by extending the length of the stop to lecture him and force him to be quiet. Many episodes of ATA have featured interactions where officers extend the duration of a detention to lecture the suspect. And although the Supreme Court has not directly ruled on the constitutionality of this conduct, prior cases indicate that it could arguably be viewed as a Fourth Amendment violation. Whether or not it was a violation of rights, Officer George's tantrum was completely unprofessional and uncalled for. Once Officer George calms down, the manager and the officers continue to question Mr. Fendler, but he decides to remain silent.
Moving on,
Do you,
register arrest.
do you have his info?
Pull up the number.
I was gonna see if you want him trespassed.
Yeah,
from here and
I
all
do
that.
want them trespassed. I don't want back to this.
Okay, so officially being trespassed from the store, don't come back to Walmart. Come back to Walmart, manager, anyone sees you, you get arrested for that.
But we don't have a picture of taken with a helmet.
Well, you will when he walks out. It'll be on the camera when he walks
true,
out.
thank you.
What's your telephone number?
Do I have to provide that, sir?
Yes, you do.
Alright. I gotta look it up on my phone.
And what else is in that pocket?
Just your phone.
All right. Give me a telephone number. Now keep in mind, if you come in here again,
His ID.
you'll be arrested and you'll be booked for trespassing. And understand, what he's telling you, you're trespassing from Walmart, it's a national system. You're not just trespassing from this Walmart,
It's
you're
all Walmart.
trespassing from all Walmarts and Sam's Clubs.
Okay. Cool.
So understand that. So if something happens and you get pulled over or stopped in one of them other ones for wearing your helmet for stupid stunts like that, you'll find yourself sitting in county. Didn't have to be like that. But how many other people you see going to business walking around with a motorcycle helmet on?
Especially with the shootings in Daytona and freaking El Paso just happening.
Your goal is to
People are going to be on edge. They're going to be scared. They're going to be worried, okay? You got someone that walks in wearing a motorcycle helmet and has a backpack with military camouflage. They're going to think otherwise. They're not going to think it's just some law-abiding citizen.
you can
See how that
walk and
looks?
chew gum,
It's like
you can
common.
take a helmet off.
It's kind of like common sense. I mean, like I said, he rides, I ride. I always take my helmet off. I mean, does it really save you that much time? Today it didn't.
Are you on medication
How old are
for
you?
mental health issues or anything?
How old are you? Tell me how old you are. Tell me how old you are. Okay, you're acting like a little child. How many times did you ask him to leave?
At least 5, 6 times. Just like he's ignoring you. I walk half the store with him following him right to the side to ask him. After I told him many times that officers were coming out and he just kept walking. You'll see.
I'm thinking about it, especially the way he's acting. If he asked him 5, 6 times to leave, following around the store.
I would say so. I'd say we lift the threshold. Why not?
So,
Especially the current behavior.
You asked him at all to leave the store?
5 or 6 times. Walk right next to him just like we're walking right now.
You're under arrest for trespassing.
Mr. Fendler was arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, and taken to the Pima County Adult Detention Center, where he was detained for 17 hours. Following the encounter, Mr. Fendler's charges were dismissed, and he went on to file a lawsuit claiming that he was illegally searched, falsely arrested, maliciously prosecuted, and publicly defamed by the department. According to the Green Valley News, as of September 1st, 2020, both the town of Sahuarita and the Sahuarita Police Department deny any wrongdoing and have moved to dismiss the lawsuit. A judge has yet to rule on the dismissal, and Mr. Fendler's lawsuit is still ongoing. Overall, the Sahuarita officers get an F for neglecting to conduct a thorough and legitimate investigation, remaining hostile and condescending throughout the interaction, and escalating what could have been a trespass warning into an arrest for disorderly conduct. The officers utterly failed to conduct an investigation into what actually took place, and essentially arrested Mr. Fendler for being quiet after being told to do so. That being said, the societal context of Mr. Fendler's actions cannot be ignored. And although the Walmart managers may have overreacted, their fears were somewhat justified. This interaction took place just days after the El Paso Walmart shooting that claimed the lives of 23 individuals and injured 23 more. So it is somewhat understandable why they would feel uneasy. However, that does not excuse the managers lying or the conduct of the officers. Condescending lectures are not part of the mission of a police stop, and there is a legitimate argument to be made that officers who extend the length of stops to scold or conversate with suspects are violating their Fourth Amendment rights. At the end of the day, this entire happenstance was the result of a miscommunication, and no one's livelihood was threatened by Mr. Fendler's actions. But instead of acting as neutral arbitrators on behalf of the public, the Sahuarita officers chose to exaggerate the gravity of wearing a helmet inside a store and effectuate a baseless arrest. Nothing that the officers did made their community a safer place, and the fact that the charges were dropped demonstrates that their actions were unfounded. Mr. Fendler gets a B+, because although he could have exercised his right to remain silent more tactfully, he remained calm and compliant throughout the interaction, made a legitimate attempt to establish a productive dialogue, and followed up up this encounter with the proper legal action. Mr. Fendler was outnumbered from the start, and there likely wasn't much that he could say or do to avoid being arrested, especially considering that he wasn't saying anything when the officers decided to arrest him. Mr. Fendler made a genuine effort to dispel the officers' suspicions, but once Officer George finished his condescending tirade, Mr. Fendler shut down, and rightfully so. While Mr. Fendler did eventually decide to remain silent, he neglected to verbally acknowledge that he was invoking his Fifth Amendment right, and the moment he chose to begin his silence could have been more calculated. I commend Mr. Fendler for his ability to maintain his composure throughout this encounter and for following up with the proper legal action. It will be interesting to see the outcome of Mr. Fendler's lawsuit, but it may be some time before a conclusion to this encounter is